Okay, everyone, it's 10 o'clock now. If you'll take your seats. Great. Without further ado, Dr. David Howden.
Thank you. Well, Joe woke everybody up, I guess, so I'm here to put everybody back to sleep. And then David Gordon will wake you up again, and that'll be the general cycle. I want to give a lecture here for the next 45 minutes on subjective value and market prices. And I just want to give you some of the motivations behind this. On the one hand, Austrians are very unique amongst economists, and I'll give you a snapshot of this at the very end of the lecture, because we actually do believe that value is fundamentally subjective, and I'll tell you in this lecture what that means. And the second reason why this is such an important lecture goes back to the reason of why we have prices and what prices function in the economy. So if you just think about your lives are fairly simple for the most part, because when you go out to do your buying decisions or whatever activity you want to do, you look at the market prices that exist. T-shirts cost $10 and sweaters cost $20, and you're fairly able in pretty short order to determine how many T-shirts you want to buy or how many sweaters you want to buy, so on and so forth. And prices are really what enable this ease of computation and this ease of life to happen. They summarize, as we'll show here as the lecture progresses, a whole body of knowledge into one number that you can look at and then compare with other numbers, other prices, to make our buying decisions. But before we just look at prices, or before we even accept prices as existing, we need to have a theory for why prices are formed. What are the factors that affect prices, or what are the different ways that prices would change in the economy? What are the factors that would change them? And this is, again, one of the strong parts in Austrian economics, in that we have a very causal realist, a very realistic explanation for why prices form in the economy, the functions that they serve, and the things that will change them. So Professor Salerno touched on this in his previous lecture, but I want to go over it again quickly because it's so germane to the topic. Before we can talk about prices on goods, we need to understand exactly what we're talking about, what economic goods are. And again, Karl Menger, one of his great contributions in his Principles of Economics was to outline the criteria that define an economic good. And these are the criteria that must be met before we can consider a good to be economic in nature, and before we can economize on it, and before we can value it and exchange it and determine a price on it. So just to quickly list through the different criteria. First of all, there must be something out there that satisfies a need. And this is very important. The need, of course, is something that we need. You perceive yourself to be in a state of discomfort, or you're not entirely happy about something, and you have a need to make your life better. And the thing out there is going to be something that would satisfy that need. Maybe you're thirsty, for example, and you see water as being something that would satisfy your need to alleviate thirst. And of course, a causal connection needs to be made with that need. So the water in that example is the thing that's going to satisfy your thirst. And thirdly, you have knowledge of this connection. You know that water will alleviate thirst, or that clothes alleviate nudity, or I don't know why I thought of that example. They say when you're public speaking, you imagine the audience is naked. I'm not doing that right now, by the way. Luckily, I'm behind a podium, so. And then finally, somebody has to have command over that good or that thing that will satisfy that need, and that they know has a causal relationship with the desire or the need that they need satisfied. And so we get into property rights here, defining who owns what and who has a command over what different type of resources. So that's the background. We need these goods, these things out there to satisfy these criteria before we could consider them to be economic goods, subject to valuation and exchange and the price formation process. Now, Austrians have a very specific, a very clearly defined theory of value, which we call the subjective theory of value. And the theory goes something like this. Things exist out there, goods exist out there, but we only value them according to our needs, and our needs exist only in our mind. And so if the need only exists in our mind, the value that we attach to a good must be exclusively a product of our mind as well. The goods, the economic goods, objectively exist. I mean, this is a podium, and you're sitting on chairs, and we have lights in this room, and those are all economic goods. They all satisfy the previous 4 criteria that we looked at. But the need that each one of those goods is satisfying at any given moment exists only in our minds, and so the value we attach to those goods is only within our mind as well. And if the value only exists in our mind, and since you're the only person who understands and knows what you're thinking, there's no way that we can compare these values interpersonally. In other words, you see a chair, and you value it according to the need that you have to take a load off and sit down. And that value that you attach to the chair and serving that need or satisfying that need, you cannot compare to somebody else. Like, person over here might not be tired and they see the chair and they don't value it because they don't really want to sit down. Person over here has been walking all day long and they're very tired and they really want to sit down, and so they value the chair very highly. But we can't really compare the two values in these people's minds. Only they know how much they value the chairs. So there's no interpersonal value comparisons. The other factor is that since the value is only created, or it's only a product of your mind, and it only exists as regards to a good satisfying a specific need, as your conditions change, the value that you associate with certain goods will change as well. So we do not have constancy of value over time. And as an example of that, you can imagine that in the morning you wake up and you're very hungry, so you go out and you get breakfast, and of course since you were hungry, you placed a very high value on food, but then immediately after you ate, once your hunger is satiated, you no longer value food so highly because you're full and you don't need food anymore. Or sleep, of course, in the evening when you're tired, you value sleep very highly because you're very tired and you need it, and sleep is the action which will alleviate your discomfort of being tired. But then when you wake up in the morning, if you rest well when you wake up in the morning, you're no longer tired and you no longer place a very high value on sleep because you've obviously just alleviated the discomfort of you being tired by sleeping for the evening. So we don't have a constancy of value. It's constantly changing. We can't say that you will always value this good at this high a level or this low a level or anything like that. Or to put it in other terms, we can't come up with concrete relationships between the value you place on something and how much of a good you will consume. Example, price of gas falls by 10%, and maybe you respond by consuming 20 gallons more gas per month. But that would be something that you do this month, and it's not necessarily something that you would do every month. So we cannot say that there's a constancy between the changes in the value of a good that you have and the amount that you'll actually consume, or the amount that you would want to consume. Now, when we talk about the subjective theory of value, the value that we're talking about, we express it in terms of what we call utility. A good will only have value according to how useful it is for you to alleviate the discomfort that you have. Or, in other words, a good is only valuable according to how useful it is to make you better than you were before. This is what we mean, or economists mean, by the concept of utility. So utility is almost synonymous with usefulness. And within utility, which is the way that we describe the value or allude to the value that a good will have, we have two laws. The first is what we call non-satiation, which is the law that you would always prefer to have more of a certain good to less of a certain good. And here, when I talk about stocks of goods, I mean homogeneous goods. Like, you would prefer to have 5 bottles of water available to you, then 4 bottles of water, then 3 bottles of water, so on and so forth. And if you think about why this is, it comes because the more of a unit of a good that you have, the greater amount of needs will be able to be satisfied. And since you value satisfying needs or alleviating your discomfort, you would always prefer to have more discomfort alleviated than less discomfort. You would always prefer to be happier than less happy. And the more of a good you have available to you, the more of those wants you can satisfy and the happier you'll actually be. An objection commonly arises, and maybe you're thinking about it right now. What would happen if, surely 5 bottles of water is nice, but if I had 1,000 bottles of water, I probably wouldn't be all that happy with it. I mean, what am I going to do with 1,000 bottles of water? And there's a couple of different ways that you can address this objection. The first is to say, well, if you had that many bottles of water, they probably wouldn't be an economic good anymore because you wouldn't have a need that 1,000 bottles of water satisfies. Like you have a need for quenching your thirst and cooling yourself off and I don't know, you like the taste of water or something like that. And 5 bottles of water satisfies that need, but having 1,000 bottles of water is not necessary because once you consume a couple, you no longer have the need that you need alleviated. So we would no longer be dealing with a case of economic goods. Or alternatively, you could say, yes, you would prefer to have 1,000 bottles of water because even if they don't satisfy a need directly for yourself, you could always trade them away to somebody else, exchange them to somebody else in order to obtain something that you want of more higher value. And that's something that I'll get to a little bit later on in this lecture. The second law of utility is what we call the law of diminishing marginal utility. And this is one of the great contributions that Professor Salerno would have alluded to in the marginal revolution of 1871. So the law of diminishing marginal utility says that for any given stock of goods that we have, bottles of water, the value we place on each subsequent unit of that good will be less than the one before it. Example. Say you have 4 bottles of water in front of you. The first bottle of water that you consume will be consumed to satisfy your most pressing need or your most urgent need or your most highly valued need. You're thirsty, and quenching thirst and staying hydrated is pretty important. So of these 4 bottles, you pick